Hola, Bart, ¿cómo estás?
Ya me callo.
Thank you and welcome for joining us today for this webinar. A few housekeeping rules before we get started. The chat function is open and the chat function is open. Please put all your questions in the question and answer section. To access interpretation, there's a small little globe, the one that I'm presenting on my screen with a sign for interpretation. You have the option to choose your language in English, French, or Spanish. I will now hand this back over to Adriana.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Linda. Welcome everybody to our consultation webinar on the use of nature-based solutions for carbon offsetting. My name is Adriana Vidal. I'm the Senior Forest Policy Officer in IUCN, and I am delighted to be moderating this event with such a great crowd of speakers and experts. So what you see on your screen is the agenda for the session. The session is divided in a couple of segments. The first part, we're going to listen to our Deputy Director General, Stuart McGuinness, giving a quick introduction to the topic and setting the scene for the next presentations and panelist discussion. This will be followed by a presentation from Frances Seymour, who I will introduce before her presentation starts. And then we'll move to a panel discussion with the experts invited to the event. The second part of the event will have all of you expressing, well, we will cover all of the questions that you write down on the Q&A chat, the Q&A box. Please feel free to add your questions at any time, and I will make sure that we cover them in the second part of the event. So one last thing to say, that this event is being recorded. You already saw the message at the beginning of the event, and the recording will be sent to everybody who registered to the event, and of course to all of IUCN membership, commission members, etc., as well as all the slides that you see during the event. Okay, so with that said, I would like to invite Stuart to start his presentation. Stuart, please, the floor is yours. Is it me? But I can't hear anything.
Really honest. Okay, thank you. You'd think after 2 years that I would be used to unmuting, but apparently Francis was observing that I had more gray hair, and maybe that's part of the reason why I forgot to unmute. Anyway, I will say again, welcome all to IUCN members, and we're really glad that you can join us. We had a very good session this morning with our colleagues from Asia and Oceania and Africa, and some colleagues from Europe, and I'm really delighted that we've got a fantastic panel that engage with us over the next couple of hours. So I'm just going to give a quick explanation why IUCN is moving ahead on this, and I think just more broadly to set the scene. I mean, we have moved from we've moved very much into the issue of a climate crisis and a climate emergency. I think for the first time I've heard climate scientists who are stoic and sensible actually say they're afraid. They are scared of what is happening, that the predictions for where we should be with approximately 1 degree warming are more advanced. I heard Sir David King, the previous the chief scientist of the UK, say this is about 70 years ahead of where what's happening now is 70 years ahead of where the models thought we should be. So there really is, I think there really is a sense of urgency. We also know, it's been well noted, that nature and nature-based solutions can be part of the solution, can be part of the contribution, can deliver a real mitigation benefit, that indeed they are available now, that certainly as a bridging mechanism to get us through to a safer trajectory, they are available. And that is set against the fact that progress has been painfully slow. That if we think more or less that the nature-based solutions might offer around 30% of the contribution, that we've seen as a proxy that the amount of effort has been about 3% of global climate finance, again, as I say, as a proxy, has gone into that. So there clearly is a mismatch. Next slide, please. Now, from an IUCN perspective, and obviously this is where we, as in the Secretariat, take our guidance. We take our guidance from the resolutions that you as members have passed. And I think one thing that we're absolutely clear on, that there is no confusion or equivocation in the Union about the role of nature-based solutions to mitigate and address climate change. And that has been, there's a whole series of resolutions and I'm only showing the ones from 2012, but they even go back further than that. So I think the issue of whether or not we should be using nature to help us in our battle to control climate change is that's been decided, at least as far as the Union is concerned. The question is, yes, we should. The bigger question is then actually how. Next slide, please. And I think clearly there have been concerns. They're all well versed, and we will deal with them today on how this can be approached. But one other thing that the Union has produced, and again with a lot of support from our Commission on Ecosystem Management, has been the framing of nature-based solutions as a comprehensive framework and as a comprehensive approach of how we work with and apply nature and the management and the restoration of nature to help directly address key societal challenges, including climate change and including both mitigation and adaptation. And this definition, it's now widely accepted globally. Our members overwhelmingly adopted it in 2016, and it really does represent a broad-based view of how nature-based solutions should be approached. Next slide, please. And there is increasing recognition of nature-based solutions and the approach that the Union has been promoting. We've seen it was heavily referenced in the very recent IPBES and IPCC report on biodiversity and climate change. Chile have obviously, as we know, when they updated their NDC, they had a strong approach around nature-based solutions. And indeed, as we look towards Glasgow and the climate COP, IUCN has got a senior staff member seconded to advise a high-level champion on the Marrakesh partnership precisely on nature and nature-based solutions. And in doing that, actually feeding into the UK government as well. And as we know, one of the 5 priorities of the presidency is nature and nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. And then finally, I think the other thing that we have done is moving from definition to say, well, how can we take all the learning that we've been applied, that has been garnered over the last couple of decades, and put them into a standard that covers the key parameters for what's required to make nature-based solutions work, and to make sure that in its application it is equitable and effective, and in fact, of course, doesn't actually undermine, but rather enhances the biodiversity basis on which the solution is predicated. So that has been, so as I said, many of you have participated and engaged with myself and my colleagues and our colleagues in the Commission on Ecosystem Management on the development of these standards over a 2-year process, and the membership strongly endorsed them earlier this year. Next slide, please. So really the reason now why we're sort of getting together is we know that nature-based solutions can make a significant contribution. The sense of crisis is growing, and one vehicle for this, and this is perhaps where we get stuck, is then the issue around carbon offsetting. How I mean, it's as a vehicle for the application of nature-based solutions, it is relatively well developed, and yet there is several concerns, and I think several of the concerns, and actually I would say a lack of trust in parts of the process, both on the demand and the supply side, are actually presenting almost, one could say, a chilling effect. So we've got this opportunity to work this through, and yet there is a diverse range of views, a very legitimate diversity, I would say, very legitimate views of when and how and by whom NBS for carbon offsetting can be used. We know that if it's done well, it could make a significant contribution to the climate solution, and it can deliver a suite of ancillary benefits that would support rights and other multiple benefits. But we equally know that if it's done badly, it could undermine the very thing we're trying to do. It could lower the mitigation ambition. It could compromise the environmental integrity of national and voluntary mitigation actions, and it could, of course, come with adverse environmental and social consequences. So the goal is here, and with this process that we're starting, is to see if we as a union, our 200 both state and government agency members, our 1,200 non-state members, Indigenous peoples, local NGOs, international NGOs, whether we can start to identify how we broaden the common ground on a pathway for the effective use of carbon offsetting and what is required, and to send that out as a strong message, and hopefully actually be able to qualify the contested areas a little bit more. But really, I think what we're looking at is to see whether the union can make a contribution now to create a sense of confidence, start to build trust, be clear on what is required, that we can maybe start to see progress move forward on this. We started off with a survey, and I'm just going to conclude now with a couple of top-line message perspectives from that survey. And I will mention that the survey is still open. So if you haven't filled it in, Sandy will, at the end of this, will give you, or sorry, Adriana will give you a direct you to where you can do so, and we'd really encourage that. So next slide, please. One of the great things, we have really good engagement from the survey, so thanks very much. We had strong engagement from our commissions. We had good engagement from both our state and non-state members, and actually I'll just note here that of 20% of all of IUCN's state and government agency members have responded, and I think that's really encouraging. We still would like to hear more. We'd like to hear more from Indigenous peoples organisations. We'd like to hear more from NGOs, and of course we really would like to get as many perspectives in on this as possible from the union. Next slide, please. We've also had really good representation right geographically. So if you, that 29% is unspecified, but if you look at the rest of that, we have had equal representation from Meso and South America, from Africa, from North America, from South and Southeast Asia. So, I think that this is, we're very encouraged by this as well. There's a global legitimacy, let's say, coming through from these results. Next slide, please. The last couple of points, what I was actually really quite surprised on was to see that there is very broad consensus from both by state members and non-state actors on that MBS for carbon offsetting is legitimate. There clearly, I think we need to take note that there's about 17% who actually who would say no, and we've got to respect those views. But equally, if you look, 85% of the membership who responded said, yes, actually, this is something really that is important and we need to move ahead on it. Next slide, please. However, there is a caveat, and equally, we've got 3/4 of the members are concerned that if done poorly, that carbon offsetting can actually be counterproductive, that it can lead to a dilution of the overall mitigation ambition. So there is, I think, taking those two slides together, there's an endorsement of MBS for offsetting, but with several caveats. And next slide, please. And those caveats actually are, I think that there have to be certain conditions, and this is what we're going to hear from Francis and from the speakers now on how can we define those conditions. But if you look at overall, 93% of you who responded said yes to carbon offsetting, but if certain conditions are fulfilled. And I think, again, that gives us very fertile ground for us as a union, maybe to try and build something, to speak with one voice from the diverse range of our membership, to say this is broadly where the conservation community feel we should go. Final slide, please. So just, I think just a couple of other things. In the survey as well tried to unpack what some of those conditions would be. And I'm not going to go into that in detail. I just want to give you a little bit of flavor of that. But 70%, over 70% of you felt that maybe the IUCN global MBS standard would be useful to help provide quality assurance to provide some of those conditions for offsetting. There was a clear, very strong majority of you, 85% and 80%, both felt that offsetting needs to protect and enhance biodiversity and must ensure the full protection of the rights of Indigenous people. So again, really starting to put the guide rails of what needs to be done to see good and effective solutions. So I'll conclude there. I'll say that the survey is open. We are going to take this conversation right through. This is the start of the process. And we will conclude, and we will bring this right to the Conservation Cafe in Marseille in a month's time. If you're not able to travel to Marseille, it will be, if you're registered for online participation, then you will certainly be able to join, because that will be a virtual event. And we will really hope that many of you will be able to join us on that to continue and start now to conclude how we move forward on this. So with that, I would like to thank you very much and hand back to Adriana.
Thank you very much, Stuart, for this introductory presentation. I hope participants got the gist of the survey, what has been answered and contributed by all of IUCN's constituencies. As Stuart mentioned, the survey is open now for additional answers. Linda or Sandeep just pasted links to each of the surveys in the 3 languages. We are going to keep those links active through August, and we will then use that information to inform, to share what is the overall view from you at the Conservation Cafe at Congress, which Stuart just mentioned. We are also going to send these links on an email to all of you the same way we have sent them before. So don't worry in case you forget to copy them on your computers. So now moving to the next presentation, we have Frances Seymour. We are delighted to have Frances as part of the event to give the first the background and more into the topic presentation. She is a distinguished senior fellow at the World Resources Institute. which is a IUCN member organization. Frances serves as an advisor to the Climate and Land Use Alliance, chairs the board of the Architecture for RAD Plus Transactions, and chairs the Oslo Tropical Forest Forum. She was previously also the Director General for the Center of International Forestry Research, CIFOR, based in Indonesia. Her presentation is going to share the summary of what she discussed in depth in her publication titled Consideration of Nature-Based Solutions as Offsets in Corporate Climate Change Mitigation Strategies. Many of the questions that you saw in the survey are connected to these concerns and how to address them. So please, Frances, go ahead, and thank you again for joining the event.
Well, thanks, Adriana. I am going to jump right into my presentation here entitled Nature-Based Solutions for Carbon Offsetting Principles and Trade-offs. And the structure of my presentation will be first just providing a little background context, and then working through three sets of issues related to the principles applying to the demand side of carbon offsets, those that apply to the supply side for nature-based solutions-based offsets, and some trade-offs among different kinds of nature-based solutions for climate mitigation in particular, and just close with some ways forward. First, let me pause briefly on the terminology. I want to be clear that the definition that IUCN has helpfully provided of nature-based solutions is quite a large universe of nature-based solutions for all kinds of things, infrastructure or other societal needs. And within that is the subset of nature-based solutions for climate change, natural climate solutions, in which I would include adaptation as well. And then within that is a smaller subset of nature-based solutions, specifically through forest carbon emissions reductions or removals, the sort of REDD+ universe. And all three of these are cross-cut with those that are financed through non-market sources and those that are potentially financed through the market or through offsetting. And my work recently has focused on that right-hand side, the shaded part of the small yellow circle. And some of the things I'll be talking about are really focused on that. But I just want to recognize at the outset that the universe of nature-based solutions is, of course, much larger. So let's get into the context. Offsets issued for the voluntary carbon market and retirements of those credits have been surging over the last couple of years. This is data from Ecosystem Marketplace, and you can see the radical uptick just over the last few years. You can also see that the most popular type of carbon credit is from REDD+, and that the highest average price, at least as of 2 years ago, was also for credits from the forest and land use sector, although I would note that less than $5 a ton is still a pretty low price. So why is this surge of interest in nature-based solutions credits controversial? The first issue is what I'd call the greenwash concern, that the concern is that any use of nature-based solutions credits would automatically imply a substitution for the buyer's own decarbonization efforts. So this is what Stuart was referring to, the 74% of survey respondents concerned that this will lower ambition. The second is a concern on the supply side having to do with hot air, a concern that nature-based solutions credits are inherently of low environmental integrity and also face significant social integrity risks as well. And a third concern that I'd like to put on the table is a concern about poor targeting, that the market demand for credits from nature-based solutions does not necessarily reflect the most urgent or important priorities for conservation or climate mitigation, nor the most effective approaches to those conservation and mitigation objectives. And my presentation will essentially turn to those three concerns in turn. So let's go first to principles related to the demand side. Clearly, I think we are, as Stuart has mentioned, we're in an urgent climate crisis now, and we've waited so long that we no longer can have trade-offs. that nature-based solutions cannot substitute for or delay significant and rapid abatement of fossil fuel emissions, as well as general emissions from the land sector. But nature-based solutions do, of course, have a key role to play in society's transition to net zero. So all sectors need to transition to a low carbon economy, but no room for trade-offs if those emission reductions in other sectors are feasible now. And looking ahead in the out years as we get towards net zero, we will certainly need removal technologies, including those based on nature-based solutions, to neutralize the remaining emissions that can't be abated. So this figure is produced by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and it's a stylized framework for thinking about where offsets might fit in to a Paris-aligned decarbonization trajectory, in this case for a company. And the orange bars above the line represent the pace of emissions reductions as a company abates its own greenhouse gas emissions within its value chain. The blue bars below the line are what SBTI calls compensation. In other words, the possible use of offsets or credits outside a company's value chain to counterbalance the unabated emissions along the way toward net zero. And then the thin green bars are those that are so-called neutralization, and those are the investments in removals only to counterbalance and neutralize any remaining residual emissions as we get towards net zero. So the key point is, in today's world, we're no longer talking about offsets to be used above the line to substitute for those that orange bar trajectory, but rather below the line for compensation and neutralization. Clearly, that curve, the shape of that curve is going to differ by sector and over time. Sectors with so-called hard to abate emissions, and quintessentially aviation, are going to be reliant on compensation for longer than sectors such as light duty vehicles, for which there are technologically and economically feasible alternatives now. Another differentiation would be sectors that face their own supply chain risks. And we're all familiar with the whole movement to get deforestation out of commodity supply chains for beef and soy and oil, palm oil, for example. And certainly those companies need to first focus on reducing those land sector emissions in their own value chains, and perhaps invest in resilience within their own value chains in their own self-interest to be more resilient and manage physical risk. And then there are financial sector institutions that may have very small carbon footprints themselves to think about offsetting with, but have enormous leverage over the portfolios of companies in which they invest, and can provide guidance both for responsible decarbonization as well as for responsible use of offsetting. So different sectors, and over time, as technology advances and other alternatives become economically feasible, we will be adjusting our expectations across all kinds of companies. Now, companies understandably will face some skepticism about whether they're doing everything they can to reduce their own emissions while using nature-based solutions credits. So they need to build our confidence that they are doing that, for example, by demonstrating climate ambition through agreeing to a science-based target. They can disclose more information so that those of us on the outside can monitor whether in fact they are making sufficient progress to merit continued use of nature-based solutions credits. They can show coherence in their corporate strategy, for example, by rewarding executives for their performance on this agenda, but also making sure that they're not at the same time members of lobbying groups that are lobbying against progressive climate policy. And finally, the issue of misleading claims. I think we're right now in a wild west of the use of claims like carbon neutral products, including carbon neutral gasoline. And companies need to be very careful about using claims like that such that they don't mislead their consumers or other stakeholders. This area of policy innovation and norm setting is extremely active right now. The Science-Based Targets Initiative is going to be releasing net zero guidance for companies later this year. The so-called Mark Carney Task Force on Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market just released its Phase 2 report and a statement on high ambition path to net zero earlier this month. The Natural Climate Solutions from the Alliance from the World Economic Forum and WBCSD released its corporate guidance earlier this month. And the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative launched its consultation report just yesterday, which includes proposed guidance on this claims issue. So now let's turn briefly to the supply side. Clearly, we have to be concerned about the social and environmental integrity of any NBS credits. And these, I think, are what the IUCN global standard addresses. And we also need to be concerned about the integrity of the programs that verify compliance to these various principles and risk management approaches. I'm not going to go into detail of these, but in this table, on the left-hand column, there are all of the concerns and risks that we're familiar with, from REDD+, leakage, permanence, additionality, safeguards issues, and some just high-level approaches to managing them. But I think for most of the people in this webinar, you are familiar with those various concerns. But I want to caution us not to feel too apologetic about all of these concerns being high risk, because there is this, I think, conventional wisdom that nature-based solutions are especially risky compared to, say, investing in renewable energy. But that's just simply not the case. And this is a part of a table from our paper where we give examples of how other solutions to climate mitigation, so non-NBS solutions, also face concerns about measurement problems, leakage problems, permanence problems, additionality problems. And I would argue, by contrast, we've been at it for 20 years. This is a timeline showing the 2 decades of experience that we've had, starting at the top with project level crediting, in this case for REDD+ type credits, through all of the experimentation through donor funded programs, bilaterally and multilaterally, up to and including more recent inclusion in compliance markets, such as the International Aviation CORSIA cap and trade system, and 2 jurisdictional standards that have been developed, JNR and architecture for REDD+ transactions. So I would argue that we've actually got a lot of good experience under our belt. And while we never will drive these risks to zero, we have some pretty good tools to monitor them and address them. Again, this policy arena is very active right now. Many of you will have heard about the LEAF Coalition launch back in April at the Biden Climate Leaders Summit. And I note that the deadline for their call for proposals is today. And that coalition has committed to purchasing jurisdictional scale credits certified to the ART-TREES standard. And Adriana already mentioned that I serve as the chair of the board of ART-TREES. Another forum that, again, the Task Force on Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market has put forward some draft core carbon principles and attributes, attempting to standardize these quality indicators of carbon credits across the board, but certainly including NBS. ICAO CORSIA, I mentioned, the International Civil Aviation Organization's cap and trade system, which has defined emissions unit eligibility criteria and continues to approve programs compliant with that. And of course, last but not least, the UNFCCC negotiations on Article 6 will be coming forward with more rules related to the accounting for international transfers of mitigation outcomes, including nature-based solutions. Now, there are many key questions that are unresolved in the use of these credits. On the demand side, we don't have sector-specific trajectories for sectors such as oil and gas yet. We're still talking about the appropriateness of different claims. On the supply side, we're still discussing the appropriate scale of crediting, and I'll say a bit more about this in a moment, as well as a key concern about minimum standards for protecting carbon rights, especially for local and indigenous communities, and this question of when corresponding adjustments are needed in national accounts. I should briefly mention that different considerations apply depending on whether or not credits are purchased voluntarily or to meet compliance obligations, and whether they're part of a domestic scheme or to be transferred internationally. And while it's clear that in the lower right-hand corner of this table, an internationally transferred credit used for compliance must have a corresponding adjustment, these other voluntary and domestic dimensions, not so clear yet. Let me finish by talking about some trade-offs. This is a table that we compiled using IPCC and IPBES ratings about different kinds of nature-based solutions down the left-hand column, and then the degree to which they have potential for mitigation, but also to provide other co-benefits, adaptation, biodiversity, food security. And you can see that those further to the top of the list are essentially no regrets options with high benefits and low risk, whereas those towards the bottom of the list, questionable benefits and some very high risks, especially to biodiversity conservation and food security if we are wholesale converting land, say, to forest that was never forested before. I'm particularly concerned about this trend in companies wanting to focus only on removals and finance tree planting when we still haven't solved the issue of reducing deforestation and conversion of other natural ecosystems. As this infographic shows, that's perverse, because the single best thing we can do for the climate now is keep all that carbon out of the atmosphere. And if we focus only on planting new areas, it'll take us 100 years, to get back to where the tropical forest is now. We will also have destroyed an ongoing sink function. There's this whole issue of project versus jurisdictional scale crediting, which I'd be happy to get into in the Q&A. As you have seen in newspaper headlines, project scale crediting raises concerns about environmental integrity due to inflated baselines, and also raises questions about whether individual projects can collectively be effective in transforming land use at scale. But it is aligned with interests of current players in the voluntary market, which is almost exclusively composed of project scale credits now. But the REDD+ framework negotiated under UNFCCC is a jurisdictional scale framework. And I would argue is better poised to not only address issues such as leakage because of the larger scale from an environmental integrity perspective, but is also just more likely to be effective because it cuts governments into the deal, and they are the ones who are the only ones who can control many of the underlying drivers of land use change. So that is aligned with UNFCCC, emerging compliance markets like the ICAO one, and also recent voluntary initiatives such as the LEAF Coalition. Many challenges ahead on that, nesting, benefit sharing, to be discussed in the Q&A. Let me just close by some ways forward. On the demand side, we need to be very vigilant and hold companies, and for that matter, countries, accountable to these new norms of no trade-offs for feasible emission reductions. We need to educate buyers about what a good NBS credit looks like. On the supply side, we need to give massive support to jurisdictions and indigenous and local communities to give them independent advice, support, and investment so they can decide how they want to participate in these processes. And we also, in the design, as these markets are being designed, we need to be advocates for increasing ambition, for high standards, and for transparency. And as Andreana mentioned, much of the content of this presentation is in this working paper, which is posted on the WRI website. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frances. Great overview of all of the things and considerations that are being discussed at the moment around the topic of NBS for climate change mitigation. I hope that the audience got even more details about the complexity of this topic and all of the perspectives that need to be taken into account. We are receiving questions again through the Q&A box. Please feel free to keep posting them. I think it would be better if we dedicate a specific time for those in the second part of the event, because as we hear from our expert panelists, the audience can also be additionally informed about these topics from the experts' different perspectives. And I would like to introduce our panel. Linda, if you can put the slide on so people can take a glimpse at who are we have. Yes, great, on the event. Excellent, thank you. So I'll start with Manuel. Manuel Pulgar Vidal is the Climate and Energy Global Practice Leader at WWF International. Manuel served as Minister of the Environment of Peru from 2011 to 2016 and was the President of COP20 in 2014. His leadership has been recognized as critical to advance the negotiations of the Paris Agreement and the Climate Action Agenda. Manuel has 35 years of experience in environmental law and policy, having worked in executive and academic roles throughout his career. Then we have Juan Carlos Hintiach. Juan Carlos is the coordinator of International Economic Cooperation and Autonomous Indigenous Development for COICA. COICA stands for Coordinator of Indigenous Organizations of the Amazon Basin. COICA is a regional indigenous people organization convening 9 Amazonian countries, and they are a member of IUCN. Juan Carlos represents indigenous people's issues for Latin America at the CBD, as well as the focal point of Indigenous Peoples Caucus within the UNFCCC and in the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. Then we have Mark Kember. Mark is the CEO of Climate Advisors UK and the Managing Director of Orbitas. Mark has worked on environment, climate, and energy issues for over 2 decades across government, NGOs, and the private sector. He founded the CDM Gold Standard and Verified Carbon Standard, and was the co-founder of the Women Business Coalition. He has worked across various areas of environmental and climate policy, with a particular focus on the use of economic instruments to support sustainable development. And he is an expert on the working of carbon markets. Finally, we have Dr. Christina Voigt. She is the chair of the Climate Change Specialist Group at IUCN's World Commission on Environmental Law. She is also a professor in international environmental law at the University of Oslo. Since 2009, Christina has also been working for the Norwegian government as their lead negotiator on REDD+, and their principal legal advisor in the UNFCCC, negotiating, among others, the 2015 Paris Agreement and the 2018 Katowice Rulebook. As you see, we have serious expertise, experience, and knowledge in this panel. We are honored and excited to have you all. Thank you again for joining the panel. So let me start. All of the panelists will answer a similar question, although their answers will probably be different from different perspectives based on your expertise. Let me start with Manuel. Manuel, what are your views on the use of nature-based solutions for carbon offsetting purposes, and what do you think is the best way forward on this issue?
Thank you so much, Adriana, and thank you, Stuart and Francis, for so good presentation, because have helped to frame today's discussion. So let me start with this statement. We're in a time in which processes, and sometimes the informality of the processes, are taking a speed that it is faster of our own ability to address it well and to finish and to end some of those processes. So probably this statement, it is not enough clear, so I will try to clarify it. When we think about nature-based solutions for offsetting and all the concerns that Francis and even Stuart through the survey have defined, have identified, we are talking at least of 3 processes that are linking each with the other. Which one are those processes? The first one, it is the process of nature-based solution, for sure. It is an evolving process. It has not been finished yet. It is a really strong one, and I will refer to how well that process is evolving and what else we should do. The second one, it is the process of the carbon markets and 25 years of carbon markets and many things that we haven't closed yet in 25 years. So what should we do? And the third process, it is the process of our main objective, the process of the net zero, how to define it, what its content, who should confirm what does it mean net zero, and all of that, the role of SBTI. So when we think about nature-based solutions for offsetting, we are talking about those three main pieces. And look, any of those processes have been closed. And the point it is that all of those processes are, for more than 20 years in some cases, are bringing concerns that we haven't addressed well. And that is why we are in a situation in which we are raising all those concerns every day. So let me start by defining some things based on the survey. It is interesting what Stuart identified. 80% of people, actors, supporting nature-based solution for offsetting, but 74% with concerns that this could mean a dilution of their main obligation. Interesting. So people is still supporting the mechanism, but on the other hand, their main concern is this could be a way to greenwash or to backslide our own obligation for real and strong reduction. And 93% say that nature-based solutions should or could be used for offsetting based in some conditions. And interesting, because those conditions are not exactly the same that are related to the concern of greenwashing or dilution, are concerns that are related to some other and complementary topics, as for example, the need to have standards, the need to enhance biodiversity, and the need to recognize and protect indigenous people's rights. So when we think about the survey, for sure, we can define different kinds of packages. There is a package that it is more related to the idea of greenwashing, dilution, and all of that, and the net zero concept. Some others that are related to how can we secure, and in that sense, what Francis presented with the IPCC, IPBES, that graphic, that it is, I think, the black report of IPCC, it is a good way to identify if we could enhance biodiversity. And the third element, it is more related to the social consideration. So the package, it is a different one. We cannot address all at the same time. That for me, it's clear. We should go one by one and trying to see how much each one of those can complement with the others. If not, we can produce a mess. The point is that we should separate all those packages as a way to address it in an effective way. So that in relation to the survey, what the survey is saying to us. But let me move to the nature-based solutions process. And let me start by saying that I am fully agree with Frances that she has divided her reflections just for the market finance side, but recognizing that nature-based solutions, it is not just a mechanism for offsetting. So I read your paper, Francis, that it is a fantastic one, and it is clear that what you are saying, carbon removal, nature-based solutions, and offsetting are different animals. In this case, we are talking on how much we could use nature-based solutions for offsetting, but based on the recognition that are different animals. And this is key, because probably some people is confusing, thinking that nature-based solution, it is just a mechanism for offsetting, and that is not correct. So it is not a requisite for nature-based solution to produce credits or to produce tradable credits and all of that. The requisites to secure high quality of nature-based solutions are completely different. For sure, it could be used for offsetting, but that is not the reason nor the objective of nature-based solution, and that is something important to be considered. In that sense, I am wondering in the process of nature-based solutions, because you, Stuart, in one of your slides mentioned how much political traction it's getting. What should we do politically? That is my first concern, because we know that for COP26, for our climate purposes, the presidency of COP has identified nature-based solutions as a main priority. But we don't know how they are planning to formalize it in a COP decision. So what they are expecting, no? And if we don't know, if we are not able to get some kind of political formalization of the concept, the evolution of nature-based solutions could be more difficult. So the point it is, what should we demand? Demand it for sure, in goodwill, no? But what should we demand to the presidency of COP26 to have a well-reflected nature-based solutions concept in a COP26 decision? That is my first point. But on the other hand, and this is terrible, no, we don't know why No, we know, but don't make any reason. It is not reasonable that CBD has deleted the concept in the draft 1.0 because by mistake, the CBD community, it is putting under competition nature-based solution with ecosystem-based approach. And again, those two concepts are different animals. And I think that there are ways to have nature-based solutions well reflected in the CBD, because the CBD could be the community that can secure that a nature-based solutions will focus in enhanced biodiversity, in secure a sustainable intervention. So that is why, and this is a personal opinion, I am thinking that to try to define nature-based solutions through targets in the CBD, it's a mistake. It should be by principles. It should be by defining any intervention on nature to address any societal challenge to secure a sustainable use of nature should follow these principles. That is the way in which the CBD should adopt nature-based solutions that can produce good benefit for the CBD community and for the climate one. So the political side, it is something that we should address in some way, because if not, we will continue discussing nature-based solutions for offsetting in the non-formal arena, and that could create more difficulties and more confusion. So that in relation to the political process. But on the other hand, we should every time, and thank you, Stewart, for bringing back or for showing the concept of nature-based solutions, because again, as it is an evolving process, it is creating a lot of confusion. And many people is thinking that any intervention on nature, it is a nature-based solution, and it is not. For sure, it is not. To secure the high quality of a nature-based solutions intervention, we should recognize, based in the IUCN concept, that there are three main preclusive values. So if we can confirm the first one, it is not nature-based solution. And the first preclusive value, it is that it is a mechanism to address a societal challenge. If your intervention to nature, it is not addressing any societal challenge, and for sure, by following the standards of IUCN, that should be demonstrable, measurable, it should be well documented, and all of that. If the intervention is not following that, it is not nature-based solution. You cannot go into the second value, that it is biodiversity net gain and ecosystem integrity. And to secure that second value, we do need, again, to go back to some principle that it could be defined by the CBD. And the third one, it is for sure all the social consideration and the trade-off and the co-benefit. So that is something that we should strengthen, because I am reading a lot of literature about nature-based solution that is thinking that because it is just an intervention on nature, it is nature-based solution, and it is something that we should for sure address. So in that sense, it is good that the survey showing that 70% of people is saying that it should follow the IUCN global standards. And the standards are good. The point is, Stuart, and this is probably not a question, but it could be an interactive discussion. It is how much the concerns that Francis has raised could be complemented by new indicators on the IUCN standards. That is something that I hope that we can discuss during today's panel. Okay, so that in relation to nature-based solution. After that, let's go to the carbon markets process. Look, friends, we have had 25 years of carbon markets. We started with Kyoto. And we have developed many mechanisms in this road of 25 years. And in every of those important times, we have left behind and we haven't addressed well many topics. So the point, for example, of the right of indigenous peoples, or things that are more related to the supply side, leakage, permanence, additionality, and all of that, after 25 years, we haven't addressed and we haven't sorted it well. And the point is why? Why we haven't succeeded in address all of those concerns raised very well by Francis in 25 years. And how much, again, by going just into the demand side and the supply side, we could do it. Or probably there is something that it is broader to just thinking on the demand and the supply side. Probably it is more related to some foundation, some principle that could set the foundation to address well the demand and the supply side. Because if not, we will continue having this kind of difficulties. Some things that, for example, I really like of what Frances said, it is the idea of poor targeting. And this is related to the third process, that it is the net zero. No? So what does it mean, the net zero? But let me leave this for later. But the point it is that this concept that when we think about nature-based solutions for offsetting, Frances mentioned this could differ sector by sector. Okay, good. So how can we address that? And who could be in charge of defining what is the difference in between each one of the sector? Because it is not just about the hard to abate and the others. Probably there are many other subsectors that we could define as a way to have a more clear net zero and to say what does it mean, the mitigation hierarchy, the main obligation, what does it mean residual emissions? Who should define what does it mean residual emission? What is the role that SBTI could play in that sense? And finally, what is that system that we do need to have well organized and well defined to address all those issues with credibility? Because currently what we have, it is a lot of non-formal organizations, entity, helping for sure with goodwill to the process. But the point is, how can we give some formality to the process that could develop good credibility? So that is more for you, Frances, because I like your presentation in demand and supply. But how to organize the system? Who could be in charge of what? Because if not, we will continue having 25 more years on exactly the same. So that in relation to the carbon market. And in relation to the net zero concept, again, who could define that net zero? But the point it is that this is more philosophical, probably, what I am going to say. It is not that the people, it is just against the idea of the offset concept. But the people recognize that our window of opportunity for a transformational change, for new technology that could address effectively a real reduction, it is short. So the people is trying to avoid to use alternative mechanisms in a time in which the window of opportunity is short. Because we know that probably it is just this decade in which we can really push actors, countries and non-state actors to do and to fulfill their main obligation, that is for real reduction. So the people is recognizing that probably later we could use this kind of mechanism. But the idea it is to avoid to put it as a top priority, to just as a way to have people using the exception and not the rule. So the rule should be that real reduction. In that sense, fully agree with you, Frances. What else? No, and probably my last point for these three main processes, it is how can we integrate it systematically? No, if we know that we are talking about evolving processes, that that they haven't closed their own processes, who could address this in a systematic way? No, that is something that I don't have an answer, but that is something in which we should think on. So I hope that with these reflections, I am really opening some discussion that could be useful for the audience. Thank you, Adriana.
Absolutely, Manuel. What a rich set of points you've made. Definitely, this is something we could only focus on the list of points you've made to continue this discussion, and I think this is what we are going to try to do. So, in order to keep things a bit dynamic and looking at the questions from the audience, what I would like to do is to give the floor to the next panelist, but also asking them to, add answers to some of the questions I'm seeing on the Q&A. So, and by the way, Manuel, in the Q&A question, we will also discuss some of the things you mentioned. So Juan Carlos Hintiach as I mentioned before, he is the representative of indigenous peoples from the Amazon, and we invited him, Koika, to hear from their perspective of the use of nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation. And I just have as well a specific question about farmers and agroforestry. Perhaps it's the perspective you can consider when you explain about this is how to promote the use of nature-based solutions like climate smart agriculture and others at the local level. What are the incentives that need to be considered, or other considered aspects for this? But please, Juan Carlos, go ahead.
Muchas gracias por esta invitación a la IUCN, Adriana, y también a Stuart. Un gusto saludarlos, a la doctora Francis y al doctor Manuel y a todos los panelistas, y la invitación a la COICA. Solamente una aclaración: yo no soy el coordinador de la cooperación internacional, yo apoyo a la COICA ahora y llevo la agenda global sobre el Foro Internacional de Cambio Climático en el Sistema de Naciones Unidas y otras organizaciones. Es importante tomar en consideración este tema. Ya el doctor Manuel, el que me ha cedido la palabra, ha mencionado varios puntos relevantes. Si bien es cierto, el doctor Stuart presenta el tema de los SBNs, las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza, el tema de la mitigación, el tema del carbono, que son temas muy coyunturales e importantes dentro del movimiento indígena. No solo en la cuenca amazónica, si bien es cierto, la cuenca amazónica, los pueblos indígenas organizados en Centroamérica y el Caribe, los pueblos de África, de Asia, todos tienen una cuestión territorial y una cuestión en bosques, en dimensiones, en porcentajes, y han hecho un trabajo importante. Pero por principio fundamental es importante reconocer que el movimiento indígena, las comunidades locales y los afrodescendientes en un principio han trabajado mucho en los principios fundamentales, que son el tema de la Declaración Universal de los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, reconocidos dentro del marco del Sistema de Naciones Unidas, el tema de la OIT 169, derechos reconocidos por muchos gobiernos y algunos no reconocidos. Bajo estos fundamentos claros y otras normativas internacionales, nosotros siempre vamos a hablar por el principio fundamental: el derecho al ser humano y el derecho a la naturaleza, a la tierra viva. Eso nos lleva a nosotros pensar que desde nuestros pueblos indígenas tenemos que considerar que somos uno solo. No podemos dividir, no podemos mirar un punto amarillo, azul, rojo. No, es una cuestión holística, integral. No nos podemos desconectar. Nosotros somos la tierra, nosotros somos la naturaleza, y en ello nos conectamos. Nosotros somos la viva voz y el sentimiento espiritual que nos conecta con la naturaleza. Eso es un poco para dar fundamental al tema de los SBNs, que nos consideramos como poseedores de conocimiento ancestral. Bajo esa línea, la primera óptica es el consentimiento libre previo informado. Un principio fundamental consagrado por todos los millones de pueblos indígenas que luchamos para integrarnos en estos debates, que ya lo voy a detallar en su momento. Rápidamente, el punto 2 es el tema de cuando hablamos del consentimiento, luego hablamos de una cuestión de participación plena, efectiva. Decimos del punto 1, del grupo 1 al grupo 2, al grupo 3, 4 y al final. Es una participación con respeto, es una participación con principios, porque nosotros también tenemos mucho que decir en esto como poseedores de territorios, como poseedores de conocimiento y de mucha biodiversidad que está en nuestros territorios. Y el otro tema fundamental que nos va a conectar es el tema, y no nos vamos a cansar, es el tema de la criminalización y la persecución de líderes indígenas, líderes y lideresas por el hecho de decir no o el hecho de decir sí y te da el consentimiento previo, libre, informado a la autodeterminación. Este es un tema que siempre tenemos que mirar cómo nos aventaja a trabajar juntos. Yo entiendo, estamos en una carrera, estamos en una emergencia, que el planeta se está encalentando, entiendo, pero ojo, nosotros somos las personas que somos sensibles y estamos en primera línea, los pueblos indígenas. En ese sentido, luego de eso miramos los temas financieros. ¿A dónde se van los temas financieros? ¿Cuánto dinero circula en todo el planeta global? Los fondos climáticos y los porcentajes que acarrea al territorio. No voy a detener en eso, son temas que ustedes lo conocen, son temas que se maneja en la comunidad indígena global. Los porcentajes son muy ínfimos e inferiores. ¿Y a qué se destina? Nosotros buscamos la titulación y el tema de siempre la reivindicación. Y más allá de eso, creemos que nosotros tenemos mucho que contribuir. Somos uno, conectados holísticamente, somos la voz viva, somos nosotros mismos, la naturaleza con la madre tierra. Y eso tenemos el conocimiento ancestral, la ciencia, el órgano de asesor de la Convención del Clima, el IPCC ha reconocido nuestras demandas, nuestras propuestas, nuestras contribuciones. Los sistemas internacionales sobre la biodiversidad, ¿cuánta biodiversidad somos poseedores? 80%, 70%. Tenemos datos territoriales, datos que nos refleja al tema de seguridad. Y eso lleva en el tema, primer marco, para terminar esta parte, es el marco de nuestros derechos. Nosotros decimos, tenemos derechos que tenemos que aclarar, tenemos que posicionar y tenemos propuesta. Poseedores del territorio, tierra, territorio, derechos territoriales, derechos al carbono, todo esto nos lleva a una cuestión. Entonces, para entrar al otro punto que la doctora Frances estaba manifestando, creo que es importante tomar en consideración que los pueblos indígenas, las comunidades locales, poseedores y dueños territoriales que vivimos en primera línea donde estamos mitigando, donde estamos adaptándonos con el tiempo y donde estamos haciendo resiliencia. Todo esto nos da un valor a que tenemos que contribuir y hemos sido objetivos mirando todo esto y contribuimos y somos los mejores poseedores y manejamos esta cuestión integral. Bajo estas condicionantes no es difícil tener que entender por qué nosotros planteamos desde siempre y no nos vamos a cansar a decir nuestros derechos fundamentales, no que nos pongan un tema de salvaguardas o que nos pongan un tema de un estándar que reconoce un tipo de salvaguardas. Es muy importante entender, comprender que cuando te colocan en un tema de salvaguardas, están reconociendo que nosotros podemos participar en todos los niveles, insistir en el tema de un tema de calidad, de participación en todos los proyectos que van a reducir el tema de emisiones y compensaciones con nuestras contribuciones. Esto nos da un derecho y nos da un respeto mutuo entre las posiciones con todos los aliados, con toda esta premura, esta insistencia en esta carrera. Y ya lo dijeron, ya lo dijo el doctor Vidal, son años, más de 10, 15, 20 años que estamos tratando de estos temas. Y nosotros estamos ahí y no vamos a claudicar. Luego, el defender los derechos más allá de lo que se plantea en las comunidades, en los territorios, legítimamente reconocidos, porque tenemos derechos reconocidos, consagrados en las constituciones. Solamente hay que recordar y hay que separar, hay que integrar humanamente los conceptos en una cuestión constitucional y ser partícipe en todos los proyectos. Y hemos tenido propuestas muy buenas. Acabo de venir de una reunión territorial en Colombia. Estoy ahora en Colombia. Y salió estos temas. Ya salió el tema del IF, el tema de otras propuestas, pero nosotros hemos tenido presencia y participación histórica. Ya cuando salen estos elementos, siempre vamos a reclamar en el sistema internacional. Y es difícil con tanta información, con tantos acrónicos, empatar, pero hacemos el esfuerzo. sin claudicar el tema de los derechos. Bajo esa constancia salen iniciativas hermosas, propuestas nuestras, que deben ser empatía, conectados con las propuestas nacionales de un Estado. Y hay ejemplos, el doctor Manuel no me va a dejar mentir en su momento. Planteamos el Red Indígena Amazonia con todos los mecanismos de trabajo, con un red convencional que lidera un gobierno. Se puede hacer, simplemente tiene que existir una voluntad de percibir desde el otro lado. Por supuesto, tenemos diferencias, pero el respeto es lo que tiene que claudicar en la mesa de trabajo. Inclusive si pensamos distinto, pero un respeto que se tiene que dar con coherencia y transparencia en el proceso. Más allá de los temas jurisdiccionales, ¿no es cierto? Ciertos pueblos indígenas tienen una potestad jurisdiccional propia, autoridad propia y tenencia de territorio propio, con todos sus mecanismos que han luchado por muchos años, líderes y lideresas en un proceso de un país, en la construcción de un país. Por eso estamos trabajando conjuntamente. Y la otra parte que es importante mencionar es que ¿cómo aseguramos esa participación? No es una participación quizás en una, decir, un líder o una lideresa indígena está acá, ¿no? Tenemos que mirar en el diseño, la implementación, los mecanismos, ¿no? De distribución de beneficios. Son detalles que nosotros siempre estamos trabajando dentro de nuestros territorios, dentro de nuestras instituciones orgánicas, que estamos organizados. Por eso digo, hay un marco de derecho que nosotros tenemos dentro de la Declaración de Naciones Unidas y otros más, ¿verdad? Y esos beneficios como dar una compensación justa, ¿no? El rol y las contribuciones para la mitigación en estos los efectos de gases de efecto invernadero. Tenemos mucho que contribuir. Bajo esa sistemática he tratado de vincular rápidamente con el respeto y gracias a la presentación de Stuart, y le comento eso, es que estamos nosotros listos para poder contribuir. También con la doctora Francis, que esa presentación muy ilustrativa, y nosotros tenemos ya trabajo a nivel de la cuenca, con experiencia propia en territorio. Y yo quiero finalizar diciendo, los pueblos indígenas, las comunidades locales, hemos hecho en este largo caminar, ¿ya? Y honrar a esos líderes y lideresas que llegaron al sistema de Naciones Unidas. Muchos años hablando de esos graves efectos que tenía en territorio, pero llegaron líderes, grandes líderes, pensadores y visionarios. Y quiero decir, nosotros no vemos este tema del carbono como una cosita, no, un punto ahí. Los pueblos indígenas, milenariamente, con tierra y territorio, y proclamamos la titulación, la seguridad territorial, el tema de derechos de propiedad intelectual, de propiedad nuestra, de nuestros recursos que nos conecta. No podemos separar tierra, territorio humano, uno solo. Y nosotros vemos al carbono como un elemento más allá del carbono. Lo vemos más allá. Entonces es parte del debate y me alegra haber conversado con ustedes hoy día. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Juan Carlos. Tus palabras han sido realmente profundas y llaman a reflexión acerca de cuál es la real dimensión de derechos indígenas y de la necesidad de incorporar y ponerlos al centro de estas decisiones y actividades. Desde IUCN, como ustedes saben, nosotros tenemos una membresía de organizaciones indígenas y en este específico proceso de elaborar una posición sobre el tema de cambio climático y uso de soluciones basadas en la naturaleza para temas de compensación de carbono, estamos absorbiendo e integrando todos estos temas de derechos y conocimiento ancestral e indígena. Así que valoramos profundamente el conocimiento, Juan Carlos, que nos compartes y así de las otras organizaciones indígenas miembros de IUCN. Now, thank you again, Juan Carlos. Let me move to Mark. Mark, you have a vast experience in how carbon markets operate, including how voluntary carbon offsetting systems work and don't work. Based on all of the things you've heard so far, can you explain or share some of the views about perhaps recommendations on how these mechanisms for NBS for carbon offsetting should be designed to address some of the challenges that have been identified before? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adriana, and thank you very much, IUCN, for inviting me to join you today. And quisiera agradecer a Juan Carlos por su intervención anterior, porque a veces sentados aquí en mi escritorio en Inglaterra, uno se olvida qué está pasando en el mundo afuera, que estamos hablando de gente, de bosques, de naturaleza y de vidas. So I just wanted to mention that because I think sometimes I get stuck in, as many people do, in the technical details of all this and can maybe forget to step back and remember this is about people, this is about real nature and real livelihoods. But having said that, I will talk about some sort of more carbon market related issues. So as Frances said in her introductory presentation, excellent presentation, there has been a massive uptick in interest in the carbon market, both the voluntary side and the regulated side, particularly since Paris, but even more so in the last year or two. And it reminds me in some ways of the early days of the CDM back in 98, 99. Those of you who are following climate in those days will remember that the CDM was touted as not only going to solve all the world's climate problems, but probably solve the world's poverty problems and sustainable development problems, and maybe even address world inequality as well. And we got sucked into that hubris and that hyperbole about what the carbon markets might do. And to a certain extent, we're in a trap. We're falling into the trap of doing that again. So I think it's essential that we recognize two things. One, that we're having this discussion today is a signal of our collective failure. The fact that in 2021, we have failed to solve the climate change problem. We're not on track to 1.5 or even 2 degrees. We've been talking about this for over 30 years. We're still way off. The fact that we're talking about offsetting and voluntary or other carbon markets as a sticking plaster or solution is not the answer. It's because we haven't found the answer. Similarly, we haven't found the answer to financing nature conservation and biodiversity conservation. And despite all the efforts of wonderful organizations like IUCN, we haven't got to grips with that. And both in the morning session and this afternoon, I've seen questions about consumption patterns and production patterns. We haven't solved the highly unsustainable nature of our ongoing forms of consumption. And as Manuel mentioned, we're here because we failed to sort out how the carbon market works. We've been doing this again for 25 years since joint activities implemented jointly through the CDM, the various standards that I've been involved with. So, and to talk about this collective failure is not to make us feel bad, but it's to recognize that we should not be pinning all our hopes on one market-based solution, and that whatever we think of offsets, and I am supportive of them, as Adriana mentioned, I've been involved in establishing the verified carbon standard, the gold standard, and other systems. Offsetting can only be a part of the solution to the climate crisis and the nature crisis. And we've therefore got to think about what the role of offsetting and NBS type offsets in particular, how does that fit into the bigger picture of financing, policies, actions, changes in consumption and production patterns, etc. So just to give that broader perspective so that we don't think that either that is the solution or if they fail, we fail. They are part of a broader package. And I'm not going to repeat all the points that Frances made on the demand and supply side issues and constraints and concerns that we need to deal with. I agree with all of them. I think the fundamental point about NBS and offsetting is it must be in addition to and not instead of the action that we need to be taking on the ground. And whether that's corporates meeting their science-based targets, being on a science-based target pathway, whether that's governments being on net zero pathways and having policies to support that, whether that's the UNFCCC in Glasgow and beyond, making sure that we're on track, this offsetting and carbon market work must be in addition to, so that we're going beyond what we would have done otherwise, rather than a substitute for that. And therefore, in that context, it's worth thinking about three types of leakage. And I just wanted to pick up on leakage as one of the issues. I could spend an hour talking about additionality, and I won't bore you with that. But three kinds of leakage. We often talk about leakage at the project level, and it's something that, particularly in the NBS space, you'll all be aware of. That, you know, if you cancel the logging rights in a certain area, or even decommission the logging equipment, how can we be sure that the foresters, the loggers, won't go 10 miles, 10 kilometers up the road and log another piece of forest? That we know about. But that also can happen between jurisdictions and across countries. If we are stopping a piece of land being deforested for palm or soil or cattle production, if the market demand still exists, there could be leakage to other parts of the world. And we're already seeing that with some of the restrictions on deforestation in Malaysia and Indonesia, how palm oil companies are buying up land in Central America and the Northern Andes because they believe that restrictions won't be as tight there as yet. So we've got international leakage as well. That's at the sort of forest protection or nature protection level. Then we have leakage at the level of commitments, you know, and it's not only are companies using offsets instead of reducing their emissions, is there a leakage in terms of relaxing the pressure for more ambitious policy, more ambitious corporate targets, more rigorous and robust science-based pathways, because offsets make us feel that we're doing all right? And I distinguish that from greenwash, which is people actually cheating, but just the general sense of comfort we have. Look, there's lots of NBS offsets taking place, we must be doing okay. And then there's also leakage about finance, and this is particularly the case for nature conservation and NBS. If we channel a lot of money through offsetting mechanisms for nature conservation, preservation, restoration, does that take pressure off international financing, whether it's from governments or philanthropists or elsewhere, saying, well, look, there is money going through this NBS market, therefore we don't need to worry so much about our financial contributions to nature and biodiversity conservation. So we need to keep an eye out on those three kinds of leakage. Given that offsets are part of this broader ecosystem of financing and policy, we need to be thinking about how does offsetting, and NBS in particular, fit into those broader frameworks. It's very easy, particularly as Francis mentioned, if we take a project-based approach, to only look at the easy wins, cheap options, low-hanging fruit, but not think of that in terms of, and this kind of goes to what Juan Carlos was saying to a certain extent, what are the needs of livelihoods, of broader conservation? And so, for example, on one of the conversations we had this morning, the professor from Cameroon, we were talking about how does NBS fit into national development priorities? And in particular, to give an example, I've worked on palm oil in Indonesia. If for the smallholders who produce 40% of the palm oil and are probably responsible for a lot of the deforestation, to create a just transition in the Indonesian palm oil industry, we'll need an array of different financing and policy mechanisms. R&D finance for improved yields and improved and regenerative agricultural techniques, probably support for smallholders as they replant and don't have an income over 2 to 3 years, perhaps carbon finance for forest conservation and restoration. None of those work in isolation. So we need to think about how NBS and carbon finance fits into that broader picture of policy strategies and financing that are needed for just transitions, particularly in developing countries, and in this context, in the land use and agricultural sector. So in terms of what I think are some key issues beyond those demand and supply issues, and perhaps addressing some of the questions that Manuel was raising, what do we need in terms of the governance of this market? Because if it's not governed and it's not monitored and it's not reported in its entirety, we will not know if we're succeeding or failing. So one point, I think, and this addresses some of the issues that many of you have brought up, is to think about the level of transparency we need. One of the reasons that the market has not grown as it might have done and is continually questioned is because it lacks transparency. We don't know what's going on half the time. We don't know, is the benefit of sharing agreement that's agreed Was that done with free and prior informed consent? Is the benefit sharing agreement free? That should all be in the public domain. Every bit of information about every project, every transaction, every retirement and every cancellation, in my opinion, should be in the public domain in real time, available to all. And that allows civil society who question the use of offsets to see if their fears are being borne out. It allows those who support offsets to be sure that their support is well positioned. It allows the world to see, is the voluntary carbon market, or the carbon market more generally, fulfilling its public purpose of accelerating greenhouse gas emission reductions, accelerating the transition to net zero, and in the case of NBS, increasing protection, conservation of our natural environment. And for that, transparency mechanism, which, as I say, should be in real time, digitally available to all, also allows us to address a key governance question, which is assessing whether the carbon market, and the NBS part in particular, are fulfilling that purpose. At the moment, we have a lot of research into individual projects, but can we be sure that the voluntary carbon market, or the carbon market in general, is driving more action? Is it doing what Francis and others have said it must do? We have very little way of saying that at the moment, and we need to think about a framework based on transparent information that allows us to judge that. We need within the governance system grievance and feedback mechanisms such that local communities, indigenous groups, all those involved in projects and transactions can not only complain, we all have the right to complain, but complain in a way that's not like when I write to my tax authorities that they've made a mistake, and forgive me for those who've heard this morning. I write to them and I get an email that says, we'll get back to you sometime in late 2027, and then I never hear from them again. That grievance needs to feed into the decision and policy making system, so that where, for example, one of the communities that Juan Carlos represents, if there are badly designed benefit sharing systems, if there are, despite a project being approved and verified, there are social and environmental impacts, that those are fed into the decision-making and rule-making process. So we're continually adapting and upgrading and improving what we're doing. And then there need to be links between the carbon market and other parts of the broader ecosystem, whether that's finance, financial regulation, advertising standards, nature conservation. So those systems are all talking to each other. So just to finish off, I think I just wanted to go back to something that Francis said at the beginning about trade-offs. I wholeheartedly agree that we're no longer in a position where we can make trade-offs between the climate and nature. We need to do everything, we need to do all the above, and we need to do it all now. However, but we do need to think about where we sit on a spectrum of trade-offs between maximizing finance to nature-based solutions and perhaps restricting the use of offsets to ensure that those offsets are as close to 100% robust as possible. And I say as close to, because we'll never know for certain, that we can never, if we kid ourselves, or if we believe that we can have full certainty about the integrity of a credit and the integrity of an offset, we're kidding ourselves. We're always comparing with a counterfactual. So it's possible to have a market that does as much as it possibly can for climate change and nature and generates finance. But in many cases, there may be trade-offs. And as you take forward this survey and you develop the IUCN position, I'm not suggesting that you have a position saying this is where we sit on the trade-off spectrum, but that we're all cognizant that those trade-offs may exist and maybe have principles to think through how we deal with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. All of these are great considerations focused on transparency, markets, grievances mechanisms. It's really a packed set of perspectives. And I wanted to move to Christina in connection to one of the things that Mark just mentioned, which is and it's, by the way, has been asked on the chat as well. There is this expectation now more than ever than emission reductions, or particularly based on your experience on RED+, but that these carbon-focused projects not only focused on the potential of emission reductions, but also with clear benefits to biodiversity, and that this trade-off that is being, trade-off analysis or considerations are put these two aspects in the right place. So based on your experience as a negotiator within Red Plus, how do you see this process, this discussion, that how has it evolved, where we are now, and how can we promote that both biodiversity and mitigation are considered? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adriana. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this session today, this morning, and now. But also thank you to the IUCN for conducting and convening this very important discussion. And it's probably just the first one of many to come, because it's an important discourse to be had both within the IUCN and internationally. And I would also like to commend the IUCN on its work on nature-based solution, on its global standard for nature-based solution. This is incredibly important work, and I'll come back to it when I'll talk a little bit more about social and environmental safeguards that you just asked about. But before we get there, I wish to take just one step back, because we are so much focusing on offsets, and both Francis and Manuel and also Mark just issued some words of caution when it comes to offsets. And we never really defined offsetting in this context of this webinar here, but offsetting means basically it's a zero sum where the sum is, it's a net sum where the sum is zero. And it means that emissions in one place are being balanced by either emission reductions or removals in another place. So it's a net sum game, which isn't really what we're needing in the climate crisis. And I'll come back to it in a second, but I looked at Francis' first picture, and I tried to take it and modify it a little bit while I was listening to the other panelists. And I tried to put this on the screen because I think there was a little bit missing there. Nature-based solutions are, of course, a much wider and much more encompassing concept than just offsets. I think every single speaker said that, and it's very, very clear that nature-based solutions have so much more potential than just offsetting. And within nature-based solutions, of course, there's climate action. There's also biodiversity, and I know that we are working on, or the IUCN is working on nature-based solutions within the work on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework under the CBD. But there's also climate mitigation action that can be based on nature-based solutions. Now, within that, in Francis' slide, there's of course Red Plus, on which we are basing a lot of experiences. And I had the privilege to follow Red Plus from the very beginning to basically now where it is. But within that whole sphere, offsets are just a tiny little dot, because Red Plus is also much more than offsets. Red Plus is also results-based payments, which are not designed to be offsets, but then there is a part of it that can be offset primarily in the voluntary market. So what I'm trying to say here is that within that huge picture of nature-based solutions, offsets are a tiny subgroup. Now, why are offsetting or balancing of emissions and removals so hot on the international agenda? I think some of the speakers already talked about it. One reason is, of course, that it is explicitly mentioned in the Paris Agreement in Article 4.1 that the overall goal is to balance emissions from sources with removals by sinks in the second half of the century. It's squarely written in the Paris Agreement, but it has been supported now by the science provider, or the special report by the IPCC from 2016 on 1.5 degree warming, which said very clearly that global net CO2 emissions have to be achieved around 2050. And with that, the idea of net emission climate or carbon neutrality rose on the international agenda. And that is why we are now seeing so many countries putting forward carbon or climate neutrality targets or net zero targets around 2050. But not only countries, but also companies or cities or universities are putting forward these targets, and many of them are based on offsetting their own emissions. But I think we should not fool ourselves. That balance between emissions and removals cannot be achieved just by balancing emissions and removals. Emissions have to be drastically, absolutely drastically reduced to stand a chance that we are able to balance the residual, the remaining emissions by the removal capacity that we have within nature-based solutions. Another alternative, of course, are technical solutions like carbon capture and storage, but I don't want to go there because we're focusing here on nature-based solutions, and all the others come with their own set of challenges. So removals will be crucially important to achieve the objective, the targets of the Paris Agreement. And here, of course, nature-based solutions enter squarely the picture. But that it is very important, and Mark mentioned it very clearly, that these offsetting solutions come as a supplementary, as an additional effort to drastic reductions of emissions from other sectors. Now, the second point that I wanted to make is, where do we see these offsetting efforts taking place? And we see them everywhere right now. As I already said, there are companies, there are states, there are all sorts of actors that suddenly have these net zero or carbon neutrality targets, and they do it all in their own way and adhering to very many different standards. There is no one overarching standard. It would be good if the IUCN nature-based solution standard would be informative for, but we don't have that yet. And therefore, we have many different standards and many different ways of doing so. And that is a real danger, because what we need for offsetting is actually a certain degree of accuracy. It cannot be 100%, I'm very much aware of that, but at least striving for accuracy in terms of what are we counting? What are we paying for? What are we trading? And that requires robust baselines or reference levels. And that again requires basically historical data or projections into the future. It also requires robust reporting, measuring, and verification systems. It requires an accounting system. It requires to be additional and all that. Because the danger is, if we're not able to ensure at least a significant level of accuracy, then emission reductions can be counted double or triple or multiple times. And that may actually lead to increased emissions globally. And it may also lead to harm to social and environmental issues outside the carbon realm. And now to your, just one point. It is therefore very important that there are strong and robust legal and governance frameworks around these offsetting initiatives that link both the international level, which is in Article 6, which is actually quite developed in Article 6, but the rulebook is not finalized yet, as we all know, with national legal system that cover the entire country and regulate that kind of activity, but also nest what companies do on their own individual company level within the political framework of each state. Otherwise, there may be double and triple accounting and claiming issues. Now, to your question, Adriana, about the integrity of the of nature-based solutions and offsetting and the experiences that we have from RED, I think there is a lot that can be learned and that needs to be taken with us when we move into stronger offsetting based on nature-based solutions. One is the avoiding of carbon leakage. And Mark already talked about carbon leakage. When we negotiated RED Plus and agreed on its general structure, we looked very carefully at the challenges and the problems that the CDM had caused a couple of years before. And one issue was that the carbon leakage due to the project nature of CDM. And for that reason, RED Plus was designed on a national level, on a jurisdictional national level, exactly to avoid carbon leakage. But now we are seeing in a way a move back to projects, and that brings again the issue of carbon leakage on the table. The second one is permanence. We know that carbon sequestration in the land sector is never permanent. It can also turn very easily into a source, as we see currently with the large rainforest in South America. In the context of CDM, there were temporary credits. In the context of RED Plus, we had safeguards that were to ensure non-reversal, and also the continuation of payments was a way to ensure permanence. robust MRV, robust monitoring, reporting, and verification systems. If you know RED, you know that monitoring is done by remote sensing. There are satellites that are circling around the Earth that help in monitoring actually the carbon content of forests. I saw a question in the chat by Simi Payne about nature-based solutions and offsetting with regard to the marine environment. This is a very interesting issue, and it's being explored worldwide in many contexts. But one issue again is the monitoring of what's happening under the sea surface, and that's going to be a challenge. The technicalities of nature-based solutions in the marine environment and the robustness that it's needed for monitoring, reporting, and verification. Now to the avoidance of social and environmental harm. Now, again, when we negotiated RED, and I speak here to my friend Carlos, because we've been working back then in Copenhagen and beyond together. We spent a lot of time negotiating the safeguards for RED+. And there are safeguards for environmental issues, biodiversity, and so forth. And there are safeguards for social issues, and especially respecting the knowledge and the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, also taking into account the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is explicitly mentioned in the safeguards for RED+. So this is something that was very, very important, both for indigenous peoples institutions like KOIKA and others, but also for potential donors like it was for Norway, that these safeguards have to be in place that both aimed to avoid negative side effects on social and environmental issues, but also enhance positive benefits on biodiversity and people's indigenous people's rights and local communities' rights. What I can say now is that the negotiations on Article 6 under the Paris Agreement, which have been very challenging, as we all know, which hopefully will be finalized in Glasgow, but we don't know that, there is very little, if not any mentioning at all of safeguards. And I think this is a very important opening for the IUCN to promote the nature-based solution standard in the context of Article 6, because there are no safeguards yet. And the safeguards that apply to RED+ may or may not be implemented into Article 6. But if you follow the discussions, you know that RED+ and Article 6 is quite a difficult challenge as well. So I think there is a really important chance, and the chance is right now to promote the IUCN nature-based solution standard in the context of carbon trading as it is being designed right now under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. These were on supply side integrity, demand side integrity. We already talked about it, and Frances gave her wonderful and very, very rich presentation. Just one word on demand side integrity of nature-based solution offsets. I think the most important one is that it is absolutely crucial to ensure that these offsets become not a low-cost substitute to important emission reductions that have to happen in the energy sector and transport sector and so forth, but that they are supplementary and additional to what's happening there, and actually do enhance ambition and not dilute ambition, and maybe are just limited to residual emissions that not otherwise can be reduced. I think I stop here, and hopefully there will be some questions that we can come back to.
Excellent, Christina. Thank you so much for this comprehensive view on the topics. So now I'm taking a look at the time, and I would like to go through a round of questions for each of you, for each of the panelists, and I would ask you to address the question in around 3 minutes maximum, to allow then for a wrap up with some key conclusions from Stuart. So let me start with Frances, and picking on what Christina was mentioning about the issue of leakage, and how, for instance, it was at the COP level, it was promoted to implement strategies at the national level, or even jurisdictional scale, with the view of then integrating this with a national level. accounting framework. You have suggested that you think jurisdictional scale crediting is preferable to project scale crediting for forest carbon emission reductions and removals. Can you elaborate why is this?
Sure. I think there's several reasons, and Mark alluded to one in his comments about how, you know, the sort of market shifting leakage where the, you know, loggers, if you displace them from this place, just move down the road that place. But and that kind of leakage is better addressed the larger the scale of the crediting unit. So jurisdictional scale better than project scale. And we can also talk about the international leakage, which is also an interesting challenge, but the more jurisdictions that we can get participating in REDD+ is one way to address that. But I think a more profound reason to think about jurisdictional scale crediting rather than project scale crediting is sort of the theory of change of what behaviors are being incentivized through the financial reward that would come with crediting at different scales. And all the analysis that I'm familiar with make clear that many of the major drivers of land use change, the underlying causes, are things that only governments can address. Only governments can set the regulatory framework, can recognize property rights, and can enforce the law. And to the extent that, for example, so much of deforestation that's going on now is actually illegal, we have to incentivize governments to do what only governments can do. And they have many other tools, you know, in terms of tax and subsidy policies or licensing agreements or other payments for environmental services schemes that they can incentivize different kinds of behavior. That having governments be part of the overall strategy, I think, is critical to actually reducing the kind of land use change that we're seeing at scale. That doesn't mean we don't still need site level investment and interventions. We absolutely do, and we always will. But for the carbon crediting part of the revenue streams for those interventions, it's got to be joined up to the jurisdictional scale, not only from an accounting perspective in order to make sure that these emissions are not, you know, counted multiple times or that there is over-crediting for a particular site level intervention, but also just to make sure that those interventions at a local scale are embedded in an enabling environment of policies that really only governments can create.
Excellent, Frances. All of those are critical points. And there is one thing you mentioned that takes us a step back, and it is that in order to address the drivers of deforestation, degradation, and loss of ecosystem biodiversity loss, the causes of biodiversity loss, is critical to have action at scale, the policies and measures by governments. So Manuel, you mentioned before that we are at a critical juncture where both the biodiversity and climate agendas need to look at nature-based solutions as basically the entry point to address both crises in a coordinated manner. And that, of course, you mentioned opportunities at the international level, how to do this both at the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the COP26. But can you elaborate a little bit more on that? How can we see a more integrated responses from the folks at the government working at the on biodiversity and then on climate change and natural resources?
Yeah, it is a bit difficult to elaborate more, but let me say in this way. We know when we think about carbon markets, how fast the voluntary markets have evolved in comparison when we compare it with the compliance one. So the point it is, how can we help first by formalizing and conceptualize well nature-based solutions in the global political process, how much that could help governments, parties, to strengthen their own capacity to define what Frances has just mentioned, because governments have a role to play. But the point it is that without a clear formalization of some concept in the formal political process, that could be a bit more difficult. But look, Adriana, here, and let me go back to something that Francis has just mentioned. We have a dilemma in between jurisdictional or by project, but also compliance versus voluntary. That are two different things. And some days ago, and Francis, you probably reminded, somebody raised the point that to develop jurisdictional approach, it could take some time in relation to how able parties, government authorities are able to define enabling conditions for a jurisdictional approach and how quick the markets are evolving. So that is a dilemma that we should address, because for me, I am in favor of a jurisdictional approach, but how able are parties, governments to really develop a jurisdictional approach that it could be a strong one, that it could avoid all those elements that it has been raised by many of the panelists. That is the first. And the second, it is, what are in our point of view the future, or what it should be the future of the voluntary market when we are developing compliance markets? So the point it is, should we think in a, we don't know how much time it could take. Should we think on how much we should bring more closer the voluntary market into a compliance one, in which unfortunately the discussion on Article 6 it is taking some more time of what we had expected. So there are some dilemmas in which we should, there are some dilemmas that we should consider and we must address. So that is why it is difficult to elaborate, but the current reality, it is very difficult for all those elements.
Indeed. But I think that we are all aware of the difficulties and we want to identify ways forward. And I think that is absolutely key. Mark, regarding the private sector, and since we're speaking about project level action, in your experience, how can both narratives be implemented in parallel? What I'm referring to is what we as civil society, we're advocating for strong decarbonization strategies, while as well, compensation and offsets done with high integrity standards. What is the things that or the arguments that are being pushed for the private sector to do these things in parallel, not to prefer offsets for decarbonization, for instance?
Well, I think that's something that's actually happening quite a lot at the moment. And I think Frances in her presentation emphasized both the importance of the supply and the demand side. And if you are a corporate who is not trying to game the system, then you want to make sure that the claims that you make are robust and stand up to scrutiny from civil society, from your investors, from your customers, and everyone. And that requires the standards and the implementation, importantly, of the standards around the carbon crediting projects, NBS or otherwise, to be absolutely robust, stand up to scrutiny, but also your claims. And I think, the two charts that Francis put up, or the chart that shows about compensation and neutralization, what a credible pathway looks like, is, a company has got a net zero science-based trajectory, which it has signed up to. It has allocated capital expenditure to reduce those emissions. It's got, I think others have mentioned, executive pay linked to it. It's got a whole bunch of conditions that show the wider world that this is not just a CEO standing up in Davos and saying, I'm going to be net zero by 2050, but there's some real substance behind it, and that there's continuous improvement. That's on the one hand, and the VCMII is looking at that. The SBTI net zero guidance will look at that, and others are doing that too. And on none of those claims, if they use offsets, stack up if the offsets aren't worth the paper they're written on. So I think there is an interest from some corporates, but not all, some corporates, the ones who are at the leading edge of climate action, nature protection action, to fulfill both those two sides of the coin that you mentioned. Of course, there are companies out there who are thinking, well, I can get a cheap carbon neutral claim by buying a bunch of lousy offsets. And that's what we all collectively need to stop. We've seen that in the past. And then one of the big problems in the past has been those kind of dodgy claims using dodgy offsets have tarnished the rest of the market of some very good projects, jurisdictional and otherwise, that have taken place over the last 10 and 15, 20 years. So it's incumbent, and I think, you know, the IUCN standards and guidelines for NBS, some of what I hope will come out of your consultation and this ongoing process will mean that IUCN will take a position that says this is only credible if we meet both sets of conditions that you mentioned. Just wanted to go back to a point that, very briefly, a point that Manuel just made about compliance versus voluntary markets. My personal opinion is that fairly quickly, these two need to be joined at the hip for two reasons. One, often, if the experience of the CDM, if what comes out of Article 6 looks anything like that, it's complicated, it's bureaucratic, it's slow, and then you've got the voluntary carbon market, the other extreme, it's a private sector company coming in, doing a project, no approvals, no processes, often no proper requirement for FPIC. We need to find the best of both worlds. The other thing about the voluntary market is very rarely necessarily aligned with national priorities. It doesn't necessarily contribute to NDCs or national climate prosperity plans. So I think what we need to do is think, how do those two come together so that on the one side is not too bureaucratic and too difficult and too political, and the other side is governed properly, so it really is genuinely contributing to climate mitigation generally, and NDCs and national priorities in particular.
Thank you, Mark. Excellent points. And then let me ask very quickly, Juan Carlos, if you could summarize in a few words, what will be your call for action at this COP26 in the context of Article 6 and the use of safeguards that Christina was mentioning? I know you've said plenty before, but if you can just summarize what will be your call for action for both governments and private sector. Please go ahead.
Sí, muchas gracias, Adriana. Saludar también de otra vez a los panelistas que luego me hicieron la palabra y que participaron. Saludar a la doctora Christine. Si bien ella mencionó algo relevante, es importante considerar a tu pregunta que la experiencia existe. La experiencia, el movimiento indígena a lo largo de los años se ha fortalecido en estructuras muy fuertes, sólidas. Si bien es cierto, muchos liderazgos y todos han ido acoplándose en momentos claves y contribuyendo. Si bien ustedes se recuerdan muy bien, cuando menciona la doctora Christine, trabajamos mucho a nivel global, y esa sinceridad de trabajo articulado de las redes bajo el sistema de Naciones Unidas, las 7 regiones, tenemos nuestros espacios propios de concertación y de comunicación, el tema de derechos, el tema de las salvaguardas y acoplando a las realidades propias de nuestros ecosistemas en nuestros territorios. Si bien es importante informar e entender, existe la experiencia, hay que conectar con las realidades en otras plataformas y no hacer un esfuerzo único. Si hay temas de salvaguardas que están conectados a ciertas realidades, pero este tema del artículo 6 nos ha llevado a una reconexión y recordar en este proceso. Por eso nosotros estamos en una convocatoria desde la sociedad civil, articulando con la sociedad civil, con amigos de la presidencia, con amigos gobiernos, porque creo que el mensaje aquí de fondo es que hay material, hay experiencia sobre estos procesos, y sobre todo tiene que existir la voluntad de poder trabajar en conjunto y sobre todo mirar las articulidades. Hay una cuestión relevante, importante, que el movimiento indígena, si bien es cierto, globalizado, tiene un proceso, tiene sus especialistas, tiene sus puntos de contacto, respetar los puntos focales, las instituciones, no solo la COICA, hay otras organizaciones más, porque estamos en constante cambio de elección o electorado y siguiendo temas. No es obstante dejar de mencionar que bajo este marco, el tema de artículo 6, hemos comenzado una cuestión muy rápida y preparación constante sobre cómo llegar al movimiento indígena y presentar nuestra demanda. Y no es solamente lo que es el tema de Red Plus, ya lo dijeron, hay muchos mecanismos más y hay que saber ser muy humilde en reconocer que sí se ha errado en ciertos puntos o a veces no somos perfectos. Creo que esa es la cuestión, no hay la perfeccionidad, pero queremos que nosotros ser vinculados con ese respeto y tenemos mucho que decir. Hay grupos de concertación, el mecanismo, el tema central es derechos humanos, enfoque el de derechos humanos humanístico, no solamente de negocios. Y cuando tenemos quejas, esas quejas deben ser visibilizadas. ¿Por qué hubo una queja? ¿Por qué se realizó este tipo de queja? ¿Y por qué? Hay muchas palabras, ¿verdad? Pero las cuestiones de esas que yo creo que lo dejo ahí agradeciendo el concepto que nosotros tenemos, esos derechos, nuestros derechos humanos, nuestros derechos colectivos como indígenas, como comunidades locales, afrodescendientes y sobre todo los derechos de la naturaleza, los derechos conectados con nosotros en uno solo. Háganle una concertación, un diálogo en transparencia, no solo en negocio, porque podemos, es un momento de unificarnos, de unidad, de la unidad, porque juntos vamos a salir en este momento terrible, luego de una pandemia y una crisis que hemos tenido y hay que reconectar con el sentido humano de foco. Gracias.
Juan Carlos, muchas gracias por estas palabras, las tomamos bastante en cuenta. To all participants, please bear with us. We need minutes to close this event. I would like to give Christina the chance to answer us something that was mentioned before, and now I'm curious about. Do you think it will be feasible for COP26 any sort of decision on MBS language or you know, some sort of mention or declaration or something along those lines to really infuse the effectiveness of the use of MBS at that level?
That's a good question, Adriana. I do know that the presidency is taking the issue of nature-based solutions very critical, both when it comes to terrestrial, but also to marine solutions. Whether that is possible to get into some sort of declaration, I don't know. But what I think is possible is to, at least in the context of Article 6 of bilateral or the sustainable mechanism on Article 6.2, 6.4, but also Article 6.8 non-market-based approaches, to ensure that there are safeguards, because the safeguards are already part and parcel of the RED concept, and parties are familiar with them, and they probably understand why they also would be relevant in the broader context of cooperative approaches between countries. So I think that should be possible, and it should not fall under the table, because there's a real need to ensure that safeguards also apply to cooperative approaches in general. And I think, again, here the IUCN has a very important role to play.
Excellent, Christina. Thank you so much. Now we move to the wrap up of the session. I invite Stuart to take the floor for a quick final words. Please, Stuart, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Adriana, and thanks very much to Juan Carlos and to Manuel and Francis and Mark and Christina. I think this has been really rich, and it's really built on a very, very good exchange this morning as well. As I was sitting listening, part of my thinking is sort of, where does IUCN, and by IUCN I mean the union, not the secretariat, but the union. Where can the union really play a role? And I do think part of this is there is a lot of knowledge out there. There is a lot of expertise, but I do see that I do think partly there is also a lack of trust between different parties on how things can move forward. And I do think that a union, a voice coming from the union of what conditions to make offsets work and that would be acceptable more broadly is actually something that might add real value. I say, and I think, and the reason why this is because we have a diverse union with governments, government agencies, NGOs, and Indigenous peoples. So I think then sort of then reflecting on how that might be framed and what it is, I think the very starting point is absolutely clear, and Francis has been clear on this, and many others have, that at the minute, and given, I think that offsets are not a substitute for rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Mark has actually given some indications about how that could be affected, certainly with respect to corporates. But the very fact that even though, go back to Christina's modification and Francis's diagram, even though offsets are a little dot, we just can't afford, the crisis as such that we can't afford to take any options off the table, but we've got to make sure that those options are done well. And so the very first thing I think is that in looking at offsets, that they aren't a substitute for this rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by other means. And again, I don't think that is particularly controversial. I think the other thing then, in looking at that, two other things I've actually heard is, number one, let's not be held back by old legacies, and we've heard descriptions about, first of all, the hyperbole in CDM that the mechanisms there were going to solve everything, and then followed by sort of a deflation that perhaps biome-based approaches to mitigation were inherently risky and had low integrity. But that's in the past. I think also the other thing that we've had is some of the legacies that have come about, some of the shortfalls from highly projectized approaches. But we shouldn't be held back from that. At the same stage, I've also heard that we should be cautious not to set the bar higher for MBS approaches than we have for other mitigation approaches as well. So let's, I've heard from several of you, including Juan Carlos just recently, and Mark, that the perfect, we haven't achieved the perfect, and therefore the perfect cannot be the enemy of the good. So I think really making sure that and sort of trying to build this space and identify how one could move forward, and how we can incentivize and encourage and energize more action here. It is actually by putting in place guide rails that I say that are not held back by the legacies of the past, but also that don't aspire to the bar is set so high that it excludes everything. So then the question is, what are the elements? What might look at that? And there are three things that I really heard coming out that I would I think worthwhile that merits further reflection, is the importance, and I think Mark expressed this in particular, but I heard this from all the speakers as well, transparency of the rules. In fact, this morning there was a phrase Mark mentioned, didn't mention it this afternoon, but I'm going to phrase it up: radical transparency. Really making sure that there is a rigor, that there's a real demand around science-based targets and disclosure and policy coherency. So that there is a rigor in scrutinizing the claims. So that's one thing. The second is actually the issue of inclusion. And I think I really liked what Juan Carlos said here, that this is, when we talk about rights, often we talk about rights in terms of safeguarding. But I think equally, that's not enough. We've also got to talk about rights in terms of agency, that communities and Indigenous people are agents of this, that they can drive, that they are actors, and that they can drive and shape this and contribute to the learning. So really making sure that when we talk of inclusion, we're not just talking about inclusion from the perspective of safeguarding, do no harm, but actually really being able to mobilize the agency of a range of stakeholders. And the third thing, coming back to this idea of not being shackled by the perfect being the enemy of the good, is that we need to embrace learning as well. That I say there is a sense of urgency, there is a sense of crisis, so we've got to be able to get going and we've got to learn, and we've got to be honest. And again, I think this nicely sort of links back to the points that were being made about transparency, that if we've got a transparent setup and we are clear on how we can proceed, then that actually gives us an opportunity to learn, and in some cases to make mistakes, but to build from that. So in conclusion, I think, you know, I would say that from a union voice, maybe really saying about, we want to move forward, we want to see this move forward. We realize that there are risks and we need to manage those risks. But also, actually, the other thing we need to do is we need to be able to work together. We need to be able to start to reinforce trust. And there are several ways we can do this so that we can start to see progress on this. Because to come back to the issue I've heard everybody mention, Manuel and Christina and Juan Carlos, Francis and Mark, we just do not have time. We do not have the luxury of time. I think Francis started off her presentation by saying we wasted so much time and now we have got to take action. So I would hope that we will work this through. I really want to say, speaking to all the members who've joined us, thank you very much. We want this to really reflect and reflect the membership and engage with the membership. And I do believe that given the unique position IUCN has in the conservation and in the natural resource management world, that if we start to have a voice coming from that represents the diversity of our membership, saying these are the ways to go forward, then others will take encouragement from that, and maybe we'll start to see more action move forward on and quicker and more purposeful uptake of various approaches in applying MBS to climate mitigation and offsetting. So with that, I would like to say thanks very much. Thank you, Adriana, for taking us through this afternoon. And thanks very much to the translators. And thank you to Linda, who has been in the back doing all the work. So Adriana, with that, I'll hand across to you.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Again, thank you all participants for joining this session. We will communicate next steps to you via email. A big thank you to all of the panelists, as well as Sandeep and Lina, who have been part of the organizing team for this webinar. Have a great day, and any sort of questions or follow-up things you want to share with us, send us an email at climate@iucn.org. Thank you again, and have a great day.